by the 21st century, anthropologists, archaeologists, and geneticists finally reached an important consensus. Humanity's true cradle, encompassing not only Homo sapiens but also earlier species, is Africa. From time to time, waves of migrants from Africa spilled into Eurasia. Interestingly, in the 18th century, the Caucasus was considered a candidate for humanity's homeland. Despite the fact that our species, in its modern form, emerged quite a long time ago, about 75,000 years ago, the already small population faced a significant upheaval linked to the eruption of the Toba supervolcano. It seems that only a few thousand ancient humans survived the catastrophe, becoming the ancestors of today's 8 billion people. The settlement of Europe specifically occurred around 40,000 years ago. At that time, however, our relatives, the Neanderthals, descendants of an earlier migration wave, already lived there. This leads us to a question that many are hesitant to ask. What was the skin color of our distant ancestors? One of evolution's key tools is variation. Mutations within a species occasionally produce individuals with unique traits. Natural selection then comes into play. If a trait offers an advantage, it enhances survival and gradually spreads across a population in a particular region. Dark skin color, for instance, is the result of higher melanin levels, which provide protection against the sun. As we know from physics, darker surfaces absorb more heat, but the real danger from the sun isn't its heat, it's ultraviolet radiation. For example, individuals with no melanin, such as albinos in Africa, face an 80% likelihood of developing skin cancer before the age of 30. Modern Europeans, whose skin contains little melanin, have twice the rate of cancer as dark-skinned Africans. Without delving too deeply into biology, in short, ultraviolet light destroys folic acid in lighter skin, which is vital for protecting DNA from damage. If you have fair skin, keep in mind that modern medicine has debunked the idea that tanning is beneficial for your health. In ancient Africa, individuals with lighter skin occasionally appeared due to mutations. However, this trait typically proved disadvantageous and didn't spread widely. During the Stone Age, the populations spreading across ancient Eurasia were predominantly dark-skinned. However, while Africa receives an average solar radiation of 2,200 kilowatt-hours per square meter annually, the Mediterranean gets about 1,700, and Central Europe and Asia only 1,000. In these regions, melanin's protective armor wasn't as crucial. Furthermore, lighter skin became advantageous in moderate and northern latitudes, because ultraviolet light not only has harmful effects but also helps produce vitamin D. A deficiency in this vitamin during childhood increases the risk of cardiovascular, autoimmune, inflammatory diseases, cancer, and diabetes. That's why pediatricians today often recommend vitamin D supplements, as its lack, in addition to causing rickets, can lead to serious health problems. However, since vitamin D is also found in animal-based foods, dark-skinned people living as hunters in moderate climates didn't face the same challenges. In 2015, a groundbreaking revelation was shared at the 84th annual meeting of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. As recently as 8,500 years ago, or 6,500 years BCE, most of Europe's population had dark skin. Mutations in genes responsible for skin pigmentation, like SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, appear to have occurred in different regions. The oldest such mutation in Eurasia that I could find dates back about 19,000 years. In Asia and the Middle East, these mutations led to the emergence of lighter skin types. Northern Europe became a separate, relatively late epicenter for these changes. According to a 2016 study, the earliest individual with white skin and other typically European traits lived roughly 7,700 years ago. However, the article notes an important caveat. These traits are part of a complex set of characteristics. Skin color alone doesn't define a concept like race, it's merely one of many features. When discussing the dark-skinned populations of ancient Eurasia, it's essential to remember that this refers to skin tone, not modern racial categories like the Negroid race, which arose after the African migrations that settled Europe. Evidence suggests that light skin appeared in Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, but distinguishing whether it came from Asia or evolved locally is challenging without diving into professional genetics or anthropology. Referring to the aforementioned anthropological report, it can be confidently stated that this trait was relatively rare. Here's where things get really interesting. A significant contribution to the population of Europe came from the Indo-European tribes that arrived from the steppes. These were the ancestors of Germans, Slavs, Balts, English, Italians, Greeks, Armenians, Tajiks, Indians, and many others. There used to be this idea that the southern and eastern branches of Indo-Europeans developed darker skin tones because of life in warmer climates, but in reality, it's the opposite. The lightest skin tones were inherited by Indo-Europeans from the assimilation of scattered tribes living in Scandinavia and the Kola Peninsula, tribes that the so-called corded ware culture largely exterminated. However, some of these northern peoples were assimilated and, ironically, many of the features Nazi ideologists attributed to the pure Aryan race were actually borrowed by Indo-Europeans from the very tribes they had conquered. Although individuals with fair skin appeared in Europe over 7,000 years ago, even during the Bronze Age, when Egyptians were building their pyramids, a considerable portion of Europe's population still had darker or tanned skin, and this wasn't limited to southern and western regions of Europe. For example, many people know that individuals depicted in the Stone Age site of Kostenki, near Voronezh, likely had dark skin. But that's ancient history. Research on the remains of the Facinovo culture suggests that around 70% of its people had dark or intermediate skin tones. And keep in mind, we're talking about the territory of modern-day Moscow, Tula, Nizhny Novgorod, Yaroslavl, and Ryazan regions. By this time, written language already existed in the Middle East. Yet during the Bronze Age, the skin tones of Europe's population began to lighten. But what truly made Europe predominantly fair-skinned was agriculture. Humans have two main sources of vitamin D: sunlight and animal-based foods. For instance, the Chukchi, Mongols, Inuit, and other groups consume large amounts of animal products, often raw, thereby obtaining essential vitamins without the need for very light skin. Europeans, on the other hand, lived in areas with limited sunlight and, by transitioning from hunting to farming, adopted a diet that was poor in certain nutrients, including vitamin D. As a result, the mutation for lighter skin, borrowed from northern tribes, provided a significant survival advantage. Along with this, another mutation became relevant: the ability to digest lactose, as milk also became a vital source of vitamin D. In essence, the predominance of lighter skin among Europe's population is linked to agriculture and the shift toward a mostly plant-based diet. Closer to the equator, lighter skin is a disadvantage. Darker tones offer a survival advantage. But in northern latitudes and agrarian societies, the opposite is true. This shift was further cemented by the formation of states, which restricted the movement of tribes. From a biological perspective, this wasn't particularly beneficial, as reduced mobility not only consolidated certain traits, but also increased the likelihood of genetic diseases. It's estimated that up to 80% of marriages in the Middle Ages were between third or fourth cousins. Returning to the main point, here's an obvious conclusion that is rarely spoken aloud. Every person alive today has ancestors with dark skin, and for many people of European descent, this was just a few thousand years ago. In fact, skin color isn't even tied to a distinct gene. It's the result of minor changes in one of them. Of course, anyone who wants to can divide people not only by skin color, but also by political views, religion, or even how they walk. But there's one simple truth we should all remember. Every one of us had 2 grandmothers and 2 grandfathers, 4 great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers, and so on, exponentially back through the generations. 40 generations ago, by the 11th century, you'd have had an absolutely mind-blowing number of great-great, and so on, grandparents. But here's the kicker. The entire population of the planet back then was only about 300 to 400 million people. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that, to some extent, everyone on Earth is related and shares common ancestors. Especially when you consider the feudal stage of human history, where the nobility essentially kept to their own narrow social circle, and most peasants, tied to the land, married brides from their own or a neighboring village. According to Genotech data, 83% of people in Russia are related to each other within the range of 1 to 10 generations. To put it in perspective, a century equals about 4 generations. This means the common ancestors of most of the country's population lived in the 18th or 19th centuries, but for genetics, strict state borders don't really exist. I've even come across estimates suggesting that all people on Earth are, on average, 14th-degree relatives. For instance, my haplogroup, N1C, originated around 20,000 years ago from a single individual in what is now China. As their descendants spread out, they became part of various peoples like the Chukchi, Buryats, Kazakhs, Baltic peoples, Japanese, Koreans, and many others. Some of them even founded dynasties like the Rurikids and the Didyminovici. And the story with every haplogroup is pretty much the same. And of course, none of these haplogroups emerged out of nowhere. They all trace back to a single shared root. Those who want to focus on differences often do so for their own, usually selfish, purposes. Divide and conquer, as the saying goes. But it's essential to remember that the things people have in common, even when living on different continents, far outweigh their differences. I may not be a religious person, but I've got to admit, this whole all humans are brothers thing isn't just spiritual, it's backed by science.